Last week I was talking to a colleague about romantic poets, and I got on the bent of why I prefer elements of Blake to elements of Coleridge, which doesn't mean that I don't appreciate certain Coleridge poems over certain Blake poems. I think it's pretty hard to beat Xanadu, but by the same token, there's Jerusalem in Blake. So the point I was making, however, is that I find Blake's visionary poetry, on the whole, more prophetic than Coleridge's. That was the point I was trying to make. And when said colleague sort of asked me to clarify what I meant by prophetic, I said prophetic, as in biblical. And I wasn't trying to be clever. I just mean in the sense that Blake's manner of writing, when he attempts to be visionary, or when he maybe just is visionary, collapses time in such a way that the present he is typically aiming to describe, which for both of them, they're both writing, the poems I'm about to talk about were both written kind of in the French Revolutionary context. So that's the event both of them are probably reacting to most strongly, because both poems I'm going to briefly mention here are written in the 1790s. The way that Blake takes something that's kind of perhaps somewhat unthinkable to the contemporary, and the way Coleridge does the same, and then collapses it into the past to then propel a vision of the future forward, I think is more successful. And I want to read some bits and just explain why, and maybe even just touch on the prophetic elements of Nietzsche. And so one more clarification about what I mean by prophetic, because I'm not trying to suggest by any means that William Blake or Coleridge or Nietzsche are guided by the Holy Spirit in the way that the Old Testament prophets were, but that they were guided by an spirit of some description, certainly. I think that's sort of the gist of a lot of Romanticism. And I have Isaiah Berlin's book on Romanticism, which I would cite in support of said point. But Romanticism is not totally inimical to Enlightenment thinking, like Coleridge certainly references. In one of the poems here, he references sort of superstition unconsciously ushering reason into this throne of the cosmos. However, Romanticism, if you describe it as a whole, has an, I don't want to say an anti-Enlightenment bent, but it begins to develop a contrary intellectual path, which is taken by other European thinkers, that diverges sharply throughout the 19th century, especially from Enlightenment thinking. And Nietzsche would be a very prominent example of where that sort of romantic tendency in the European intellectual circles can go. One other note is that last year, if I were to try and do this, I would have sat down and attempted to write this into a Substack essay. I'm not running a personal Substack anymore because Substack has aligned itself with the verification softwares that are in vogue of the day. So I'm just gonna say it here. And also this is obviously less polished than writing it, because I would spend months writing it and then hammer it all out with criticism and editing from friends. But that takes a lot of time, and I don't have much time anymore, so the little ramble will be it. So, Coleridge, we'll begin with you. He wrote a prophetic poem, which he began, according to sources, in around 1795, when he was helping another poet write about Joan of Arc. and he kind of stole a bunch of lines that he should have been committing to this other poem, and kind of kept them tucked away from himself, and over the next 4 years tried to finish this poem, which is called The Destiny of Nations, a Vision. He tried to finish it for his own work, and he never really came to fruition. So it's still an unfinished poem, but that's okay, because a bunch of Blakes that we're going to talk about are in that camp too. So extensively worked on over years, never published in a finished form. That's okay. It has obviously a sustained sentiment that was developed and refined, a sustained vision that was sustained and refined over years, and that's what I'm interested in, not assessing what the difference between a finished and unfinished poem stands in the oeuvre of an author. So I'm not going to make any points on Foucault now. In The Destiny of Nations, as I mentioned, Coleridge tackles this at the outset as a subset of work he's doing on Joan of Arc from another poet, and so this poem eventually gets around to referencing her, and then spends most of its time vaguely alluding to her. It never uses her name, just calls her the warrior maid of France, and then for the rest of the poem she's the virgin or the maid. So you can see already in simply describing Joan of Arc as the warrior maid, and then immediately collapsing her into this identity as the virgin, capital V, Coleridge is trying to do something where he's collapsing maybe a past into a deeper past, which is interesting, and I think it's there's symbolic richness. I can see what he's trying to do, and in so doing, he's trying to draw out a point about the destiny of nations. In this case, presumably France, right? He's writing in the 1790s. The revolution is in swing, reign of terror, all sorts of horrible things happening, and so part of this vision is our battle maid communes with a spirit, or perhaps the spirit, as in this kind of romantic deity. Again, romantic, talking about this intellectual movement, so viewing God not as a revealed trinity of Christianity, more as a universal spirit. See Emerson for like an American who really presents the deity in this way. So it's kind of a V is sometimes on panpsychism, deism. It's an attempt to allow a neo-paganism to breathe without totally eschewing a claim to a Christian culture, which again, Romanticism is setting the seeds which will come to fruition in the 19th century when it comes to this sort of, or in the 20th century when it comes to this sort of European paganism that claims a cultural heritage with elements of Christianity. And I think if you consider for a moment, there was at least one, if not two, states in the middle of the 20th century who made that claim and then made a problem for everybody else surrounding romantic ideas of religion. So Coleridge takes his spirit, his sort of pan-psychic entity, and has it commune with the warrior maid of France who scourged the invader. And then he describes her upbringing, and he sort of puts her through this this mythic, symbolic journey, encountering poverty among shepherds, and sort of being confronted as part of her process of being called out. There's sort of like an enunciation element, but it's an extended passage, whereas in the biblical context, the Virgin Mary, the Theotokos, receives the annunciation of the Archangel Gabriel, and then obviously participates in the economy of salvation subsequent to the Annunciation. This is kind of like a prolonged Annunciation experience, like imagining an extended visionary process. And then at the end of which, and again, part of this comes through the unfinished sections, or at least there's like almost like a gap in the middle, and then it kind of resolves. But she views war through this, not just poverty and suffering and etc., but she is confronted with visions of war, and of course Coleridge cites many biblical symbolic characters such as Leviathan in his description of that. And then he uses an image from Hesiod of war and peace striving as kind of elementary forces. And so the maiden, Joan of Arc, is confronted by this. The maiden paused, musing what this might mean, but long time passed not ere that bright cloud returned, more bright along the plain it swept. And so she is once again receiving a visionary explication of events from the tutelary spirit. And the sort of final message that she's delivered before the poem wraps up, and we presume she would at this point enter into her warrior phase, go and defend France from the English. We have the spirit, maiden beloved and delegate of heaven, to her the tutelary spirit said, so shall the morning struggle into day, the stormy morning into cloudless noon. Much hast thou seen, nor all canst understand, but this be thy best omen, save thy country. Thus saying, from the answering maid he passed, and with him disappeared the heavenly vision. So having received the vision of this kind of clouded war, this prolonged, protracted birth pain of the world, she's then told, oh, it's okay, it'll resolve in today, and then here's your omen, which is not so much an omen as it is just a message and injunctive, but save thy country. All right, and then Coleridge breaks off, and he just goes into the kind of deistic ramble. He says, glory to thee, Father of earth and heaven, all conscious presence of the universe, nature's vast ever-acting energy, in will, indeed, impulse of all to all. All right, so impulse of all to all. There's a pantheistic element within Coleridge, and this is where I think, right, switching to Blake exceeds over Coleridge. So my problem with Coleridge's poetry is that as he collapses past into past, so, Joan of Arc into these biblical themes, pagan themes, to explicate ongoing events in France, he does so through through reference to this universalist force, and there is no claim made as to why the universalist force here prefers one agent, whether that be an individual or a nation, over another, except that, again, going back to that earlier line where he says, where he talks about, here we go, till superstition with her unconscious hand seat reason on her throne, right? So this is this idea that sort of the supreme being, the deity, just simply kind of generically moves through history, perhaps in a Hegelian sense, perhaps in purely like a blind idiot God Lovecraftian sense, but just generally gesturing people into enlightenment of some kind, right? Whether it be a romantic sense of enlightenment, where there's sort of still this appreciation of the pagan and the natural and the sort of ritual, or whether it be like a more progressive enlightenment that deals with sort of scientific veracities. So where do I think Blake is superior? Well, Blake doesn't present a generic supreme being. So Blake presents in much more of a pagan context, a prophecy that deals with angels or spirits of the nations. And so in Blake, when he comes to confront, and I'm going to probably look at least referencing two poems here. One's a manuscript called Tyriel, which is from 1789, so right on the eve of the Revolution. And the other is America, a Prophecy from 1793. But in both these poems, he presents his deities in a particularized sense. So his deities, such as Albion, and then the American deity, which is called Orc, or this other in the earlier poem Tyriel. He has the King of the West, Tyriel. These spirits, and in Tyriel's case, there actually is not entirely clear if we're talking about spirits or if we're talking about sort of patriarch kind of mighty men of renown, Nephilim kind of agents. But these beings are particular. They are tied to a place. There isn't this general sense that history simply moves through whomever agent the universal benevolence brings all to all. or seeks to bring all to all through. So, okay, here's Joan of Arc. Somehow she has been selected as the agent by which the universal benevolence shall move all into all. Therefore, she's going to be shown this vision and then sent off to the French people. And then, she goes and brings more rationality or more freedom or more emancipation. And so, therefore, the destiny of all nations can be localized to this instance. And this tells us something about the French Revolution, right? Who knows who the Joan of Arc in this context is, if it's even localized to one individual. The point being that the movement is an all through one to all right? Now this is deeply unsatisfying in the literary context, but also it's deeply untrue. This pantheistic, all deistic spirit is not real. And that's obviously the case if you really read anything, because to acknowledge it to be the case means ignoring the particulars of literature and history, even to an extent of philosophy, in order to reduce agents and reduce being into totally nondescript homogeneities. What do I mean by this? So to claim that the same agentic being, the same all that resolves everything into itself, is the same deity that's present in, for example, the actions of Brutus, which I've put Coleridge down, but in Brutus and Leonidas, and then also present in Joan of Arc, right, is actually to dismiss any particularity in the forms of literary expression, of ritual expression, of historical expression of each of these beings. All right, so there is now no difference between the ritual act of Brutus, the Roman pagan, or Leonidas, the Spartan pagan, and Joan of Arc, the Catholic mystic warrior saint. And I think if you are intellectually rigorous, or at least not self-deceptive, you cannot for an instant claim to suggest that there is a through line between either ritual, literary, or historical practice, right? So the literary expression of a Brutus versus the literary expression of who Joan of Arc is, similarly with their ritual expressions as real historical people, their historical role and existence, right? There is not a through line by which they can be connected, except if we were to strip down those agents into bland nothingness, all right? So if we would totally ignore all circumstances of ritual, history, and literary quality in those figures, then can we say they're the same? But otherwise, right, this is not the case. And so this is a danger that you get it all the time in liberal arts studies. A specific example would just be to say that, oh, look, when Socrates says excellence, or Aristotle says arete, excellence, this is the same as what St. Paul writes in his epistles. I got marked down this on my first ever philosophy essays at uni, and it's a point that stuck with me, right? But it's just we cannot be so careless in history, literature, in any domain, to abstract to the point where signifiers become meaningless, to the point where words become meaningless. So I can call Brutus a saint because he tears down the tyrants, and if I call Joan of Arc a saint because she tears down tyrants, then I've actually turned the concept of saint, tyrant, and various other concepts into meaningless designators, because fundamentally there is very little in common between the two figures in ritual, historical, literary contexts. And so that's the danger we run. So again, going back from Coleridge, who's Mr. Pantheistic, the deity just simply takes the all, which is messy in its particulars, and then moves it through the individual agent into the all, which is somehow no longer messy, like whatever that means. Again, this is the Neoplatonic quandary about how on earth you can resolve into absolute being and retain identity. But opposed to this, Blake is a particularist. He does simply present spirits of the nations or mighty men of renown in the kind of Nephilim context. or patriarchal figures or matriarchal figures of a sort of ancient character. And he will play with like Hebrew and Greco-Roman identities, but he's doing so not by saying that this Indo-European and this Semitic culture are fundamentally the same, but he's just recognizing that they existed in a cultural continuum. I mean, they're very, very ancient Proto-Greek myths, and then the Torah, the Old Testament, these do interact. There are references, of course, to the Greeks in the Old Testament. Anyway, I can't go into further detail, maybe another time. So Blake is taking the particular. And so the question in Blake, when he does a similar thing, so Blake takes a present reality, collapses it into the past, right, into these larger than life spirits and identities. So he does all of this, and then he writes how that present is a divine reality unfolding. All right, similar to how the prophets will talk about. I was just reading Isaiah this morning, and it's talking about the fall of the king of Babylon under the Medes. All right, so you have this present historical reality for Isaiah, king of Babylon, and he's soon to be overtaken by the Medes and destroyed. And then all of a sudden, right, you get this lengthy exegesis on the morning star, on Lucifer. So you have this astrological and spiritual reality collapsing into the real historical event. And then this is what I mean by the prophetic mode. This is probably a really good example of Isaiah 12, 13, 14, right? Read those passages, see what Isaiah is doing when he talks about the king of Babylon, which is present reality for him. And then he's speaking of he will be, conquered by the Medes and the Persians, which is this is a future reality, but some will argue it's a present reality because they backdate it. Anyway, whatever the case may be, he's taking present realities, collapsing it into primeval events, so astrological, astronomical events, and then spiritual events. So the fall of Lucifer, the fall of the morning star, is analogous to the fall of the king of Babylon, and yet there'd be very few who claim that, well, when it took all the way up until the king of Babylon at the time of Isaiah and the Iron Age or whatever for Satan to fall from heaven. No one would make that claim. Okay, so what he's doing is he's taking the past, a divine past, kind of an atemporal past, the fall of Lucifer, the fall of the morning star, comparing it to present astronomical events, because there's there were signs in the heavens that we can ascertain by comparing, obviously, what we know of the movements of the stars and also of omen lists from contemporary Sumerian cultures. And then he collapses that into the present king of Babylon political drama, which we know is the king of Babylon is to be assassinated, and then his kingdom is to be overtaken by the Medes. Herodotus writes this. You can read Herodotus. Anyway, so that's the prophetic mode that Blake is also taking part in. He takes, in the case of America, a prophecy, the American Revolution, and then he collapses it into an astrological past, and also a primeval divine past. So how does he do this? So he begins by talking about Red Orc, who is to become, in a sense, the tutelary spirit, the guardian spirit of the Americas. And he takes on form of eagle, lion, whale, and serpent, right? These all kind of different ways in which Orc can be understood. And he goes to confront, on behalf of the present reality, Washington, Franklin, Payne, and Warren, Gates, Hancock, and Greene, meet on the coast glowing with blood from Albion's fiery print. So that he goes to meet with these real individuals to wage war with them, or to support them, or to become their tutelary spirit in the war against the guardian spirit of Albion. So what happens here? Well, Albion, the ancient regime, Urizen, he sends forth plagues to combat America. And then Orc drives them back by starting fires, and those fires drive the plagues back, and the plagues end up actually besetting those who live in England. And so the poem ends, I've done it like a super condensed version, because there's obviously a lot going on. It's quite a lengthy poem, but Orc essentially defeats the flames of the old regime defeats the plagues of the old regime by driving it back with his flames, his hellfire, right? So the alliance of America, their tutelary spirit, is the revolutionary fire that fights the plagues of the ancient regime. And I've just taken my book. I found it anyway. So at some point, there's a confrontation between Orc and between the spirit of Albion. And so I'll read this section. But the terror answered, I am Orc, wreathed around the accursed tree. The times are ended, shadows pass, the morning begins to break. The fiery joy that Horizon perverted to 10 commands. What night he led the starry host through the wide wilderness. That stony law I stamp to dust and scatter religion abroad. To the four winds the torn book, and none shall gather the leaves. But they shall rot on desert sands and consume in bottomless deeps. To make deserts blossom and the deeps drink to their fountains, and to renew the fiery joy and burst the stony roof. That pale religious lechery, seeking virginity, may find it in a harlot and in coarse-clad honesty. All right, so I could read on, but I won't. The point being that Orc stands for this sentiment that wants to break the confines of what he describes as fiery joy from the stone of the 10 Commandments. That's the symbol being made. And so he's to scatter religion through his revolutionary impulse. And so that idea of Urizen, this Ancient of Days figure, standing for the 10 Commandments, for codified law, and then Orc standing for fires of rebellion, of revolution that will burn it down, is sort of how Blake is collapsing the struggle between ancient regimes and revolutionary regimes. And of course the poem has to end, because it was written in 1793, with a look to France. And so he ends the poem by talking about how not only have Orc's fires driven the plague of the old world off America's shores and back into Europe. So now Europe festers under its own plague and begins to yearn for the fires of Orc to purify it. But then he ends the poem by referencing the fact that those fires have indeed spread to Europe. They've spread to France. And so what is interesting about Blake is that Orc is quite clearly a demon. All right, and you can make the case, and I think Blake is making the case, that Urizen, or the spirit of Albion, is also sort of this daemonic entity. Neither are, in Blake's vision of the divine realm, benevolent, all-good deities. Now, does that make Blake truer? In some respects, yes. And not because I think, not because I'm making the case that there isn't a benevolent deity, obviously not. But what Blake is doing is he's taking a reality, which is that nations have angels, have spirits. At least it's a reality as the Bible presents it, right? As the Old Testament prophets, as the New Testament writers present it, is that there are spirits assigned to nations, and he pits them against each other, but not in the sense of, oh, but these are all just simply kind of forces working towards the common resolution of everything into everything again, right? Oh, we originally had the one, the all, the absolute, and it was scattered into confusion and particularity, and the process of history is simply everything reassembling into rational, ordered, democratic, religiously enlightened, progressive things that resolve into the all once more and at the end of history, or whatever the case may be. So no, Blake goes, no. There's just demons rampaging war upon each other, right? Are the fires of Orc better than the plagues of Urizen? Well, when you're like suffering from the leprosy, sure, all right, you might want to purge the fire, but then there is no evidence in here that the fire is ever put out. In fact, Orc kind of boasts in his ability, and so there's a very close parallel. Not that I think Blake could have known of this, but between his poetry of America of prophecy and the Baal cycle, the Baal cycle, the ancient tablets that tell the story of the devil, it's frankly frighteningly familiar. So again, whatever spirit Blake is engaged with in writing his prophecies, right? Who knows? So why bring this up? Well, partially because I just wanted to point out that these romantic authors are trying to, and in some cases perhaps succeed in to write prophecy, because I'd argue that what Blake writes of America and the way that its revolutionary flame is in constant battle, not against the forces of good, but against these other kind of sickly forces of plague, I think that is a present reality. I think that is something that we see in the rhetoric around the present war that is going on at the time of me talking about this, because how is intervention in the regimes of the Middle East presented? It's not, I mean, it is presented as of course, like cool and moral, or maybe not even moral. There's just a lot of like, you know, the dumb videos where it makes it look cool, like, you know, Top Gun clips or whatever. But you have these presentation on the American side of, oh, well, what we're doing is we're going to go in there, we're going to clean them out, and there's this sickly old force, right? The corruption, this clandestine deals, right? The old order that someone like Ayatollah represents, right? The backwards Islamic regime, so on and so forth. We're the fire to purge that. But it's quite clear that they're not coming from a moral standpoint. I mean, again, it's not to say that the plague may be very, very real. All right, the plague of the spirit of that nation may be afflicting its people, but does it moralize? Does it justify the flames that are sent to drive it out? So I think Blake is prophetic. I will stand by that, not in the sense that he's inspired by the Holy Spirit, but that he can collapse present realities into the past such that they actually indicate future reality. I would go on and talk about Nietzsche, but I've spoken for way too long already. And so those are just my thoughts on how to understand elements in Romanticism and why there is utility and relevance to them, but also where they fall apart. So for example, any romantic who gets too caught up in this pantheism, I think, ultimately has a lot less to say than a character like Blake, who is very happy to simply talk about feuding, feuding evil powers, spirits of the nations. And so there's something actually darkly real in Blake, not that we should confuse it for the total reality, but it arms us much better in a conscious capacity than the wishy-washy elements of Coleridge's pantheism. So, random thoughts on a Monday afternoon about Romanticism.